I want to look at the concept of a calendar for a second. Because we usually treat them as these really benign, just organizational tools, right?
Right, yeah, like a grid of days.
Exactly. A grid of days, months, maybe you have a few holidays circled in red. You flip the page, the numbers reset, you pay your rent, and life just goes on.
It implies a sense of order, you know.
Yes.
You're moving from one structured unit of time to the next, and there's a comfort in that predictability. I mean, the system functions because it's fundamentally stable.
But that's the illusion, right? Because looking at this absolute mountain of research you brought in today, and thank you for this, by the way.
Oh, anytime.
This massive, incredibly dense diagnostic of the 2026 Hollywood movie and television release slate, I mean, that sense of order completely shatters.
It really does.
This doesn't look like a calendar to me. It looks like a casualty report from a corporate war zone.
That is actually a very accurate assessment. When you break down the logistics, the budgets, and the overlapping release strategies of 2026, you are looking at an industry that is simultaneously terrified of its own shadow and completely willing to jump out of an airplane without a parachute.
Right.
It's a landscape defined by this massive structural anxiety, but also borderline reckless ambition.
And my goal today is not to just sit here and read a list of release dates to you. I mean, that is what a Wikipedia page is for, right?
Exactly.
The mission of this deep dive is to really tear open the hood on these upcoming projects. We want to understand the billion-dollar bets, the hidden corporate strategies, and the tectonic shifts in how we actually consume narratives.
Because 2026 is a year of unbelievable extremes.
It's wild. You look through these notes you brought, and you have Christopher Nolan shooting a massive theatrical epic entirely on 70mm IMAX film.
Which is an undertaking in itself.
Right, but the detail buried in here that really caught my eye is that apparently for the first time in his entire career, he managed to wrap production without destroying a single multi-million-dollar IMAX camera.
Oh, wow, yeah. Which, if we look at the physical mechanics of IMAX filmmaking, is a huge logistical triumph.
I can't even imagine.
I mean, those cameras are not designed for nimble, practical filmmaking. They're literally the size of a microwave.
Really?
Oh, yeah. They weigh a ton, and you typically have to mount them on these heavily reinforced rigs. So to shoot an entire feature without a catastrophic equipment failure implies a level of on-set control that is almost unheard of in modern blockbusters.
It is the absolute pinnacle of the theatrical monument. But then on the flip side, we get to December 2026.
The Great Clash.
Yeah, the notes outline this box office collision course that is so intense, so historically dense with massive IP, that there is a genuine sentiment in the industry of people wanting to just fast forward through the spring and summer just to witness the carnage.
The December schedule is a perfect encapsulation of the central contradiction of 2026.
How so?
Well, you have major studios that are heavily leveraged, desperately clinging to established intellectual property. Because, you know, the board of directors demands a safe return on investment.
Right, the safe bets.
Exactly.
Then,
Yet, on the exact same weekend, those same corporate entities are handing auteur directors hundreds of millions of dollars to create these completely uncompromising, highly risky, singular visions.
it is a massive push and pull.
Yeah.
And I want to dig into that first group you mentioned, right? The safe bets. The properties that just refuse to end.
The Immortals, yeah.
Because there is a concept in these notes that perfectly describes this phenomenon, and it's labeled vitamin M.
Yes, vitamin M, the most essential nutrient in the Hollywood ecosystem.
Sunny.
Pure money.
It drives a very specific, almost tragic cycle of storytelling. I look at the early part of this 2026 slate, and the analogy that comes to mind is it's like attending a retirement party for a coworker you've spent 30 years with.
Right, okay.
You listen to the beautiful speeches, you watch the slideshow, you shed a tear, you slice the cake, and you say this really heartfelt goodbye. And then, the very next morning at 9 a.m., you walk into the office and they are sitting right at their desk, typing away like the party never even happened.
Which completely invalidates the emotional catharsis of the goodbye.
Exactly.
But that is the mechanism of vitamin M. It essentially dictates that a narrative cannot simply find its natural resting place if there is still, residual capital to be extracted from the brand awareness.
So let's track how this plays out, starting right on January 1st, 2026. Or, as the notes clarify, it's dropping late night on December 31st to capture the New Year's audience.
Right, the final episode of Stranger Things.
Yeah.
This is a fascinating baseline because it really represents the definitive end of an era. I mean, we have tracked the mythology of Hawkins and the Upside Down for years now.
It feels like a lifetime.
But notice the structural challenge here. The gap between the penultimate season and this finale is so vast that the cultural momentum has essentially evaporated.
It really has. The research points out that Netflix is going to have to rely heavily on extensive recap content and massive algorithmic pushes just to remind audiences of the stakes.
Because we have been away from these characters for so long that the psychological investment has decayed.
Right.
It highlights a real vulnerability in the streaming model. Television traditionally relied on behavioral habituation, tuning in every week or at least every year.
Like clockwork.
Exactly. But when you stretch production cycles to accommodate these blockbuster-level visual effects, you break that habituation.
You lose the habit.
Yeah. But fundamentally, Stranger Things is allowed to end. Television, by its very nature, builds toward a series finale.
But the theatrical space operates under a completely different set of physical laws, doesn't it?
It really does.
If a movie makes money, the story isn't over. Which brings us to June 19th and the release of Toy Story 5.
Here we go.
Now, I have to challenge the logic here. I mean, the consensus was that Toy Story 3 was a masterpiece of thematic closure.
Oh, universally agreed upon.
Andy hands the toys over to a new generation, the cycle of childhood play is honored, and the narrative loop is just perfectly closed. I mean, we wept.
We all wept.
So why mandate that these characters come out of a perfectly executed retirement?
Because you have to look at this through the lens of a spreadsheet, not a script.
A spreadsheet.
Yeah. Creating a completely original animated IP is one of the most perilous financial gambles a studio can possibly take.
Really? More than live action?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You are asking a global audience to form an emotional bond with a character design they have never seen in a world they don't understand at all. The marketing spend required just to establish baseline awareness is astronomical.
So it's just pure risk aversion.
Exactly. When a studio executive looks at Toy Story, they aren't looking at a narrative arc. They're looking at a guaranteed baseline yield. The generational brand awareness is already subsidized by 30 years of cultural saturation. The consumer products division relies on the merchandising revenue. The theme parks rely on the character relevance.
Right. The rides have to stay relevant.
And so Toy Story 5 is essentially an exercise in corporate infrastructure maintenance.
Corporate infrastructure maintenance? That sounds so bleak for Woody and Buzz.
It is. And the real danger, however, is that at a certain point, endless expansion begins to erode the foundation of the IP itself.
How do you mean?
Well, if Woody and Buzz have a profound existential crisis every 4 years, the emotional weight of their original journey is retroactively diluted.
Yeah, it turns them from actual characters into, like, indentured corporate mascots.
That's a great way to put it.
And this dynamic isn't just limited to animation either. Look at the live-action slate on December 11th, Jumanji 3. We have the core cast reuniting. So that's The Rock, Jack Black, Kevin Hart, Karen Gillan. And the studio is aggressively marketing this as the quote-unquote final film in this specific iteration of the franchise.
I mean, the word final in modern theatrical marketing is almost entirely devoid of semantic meaning.
I completely agree. The notes are deeply skeptical of that branding, and honestly, they should be. We've seen a dozen franchises promise a final chapter only to come back a few years later.
Well, that branding is usually a byproduct of back-end profit participation rather than actual narrative finality.
Wait, really? Unpack that for me.
Sure. So when a franchise reaches its third or fourth installment, the cast's contracts are usually up for renegotiation. The stars, rightfully, demand a much larger percentage of the gross profits.
Makes sense. They built the franchise.
Right. But eventually, the fixed costs of the talent become so bloated that the margins on the film shrink dramatically, even if the box office remains totally consistent. So claiming it as the final film is often just a negotiating tactic or way to justify the massive talent buyout before putting the property on ice for a 5-year reboot cycle.
Oh, wow. So it's just the illusion of an ending to drive opening weekend urgency.
Pretty much.
But if we want to talk about the absolute opposite of an ending, like the most aggressive, accelerated attempt to capture vitamin M, we have to look at January 14th with 28 years later, The Bone Temple.
The production logistics on this one are genuinely remarkable.
They are staggering. The notes highlight that this sequel is hitting theaters a mere 6 to 8 months after Part 1.
Which is almost unheard of for a film of this scale.
Right, and the only way that is physically possible is because the studio greenlit and shot both massive films back to back.
Yes.
The research actually draws a parallel to the regional hit Pushpa 1, where the first film ended on a relatively closed note, but because sequel's already in the can, they just rolled right into it. But the risk profile in 28 years later is fascinating to me.
It is the ultimate corporate hedge against production inflation, but it carries catastrophic marketing risk.
Catastrophic.
Let's break down the unit economics. By shooting back-to-back, you amortize the massive physical production costs. You only have to build the post-apocalyptic sets once.
Oh, right. That saves millions.
Exactly. You negotiate long-term holds on crew and equipment, which lowers the weekly burn rate. So from a purely operational standpoint, 2 movies shot together cost significantly less than 2 movies shot 3 years apart.
But the audience hasn't weighed in yet.
Precisely. You're placing a massive bet that the cultural appetite for the first film will be ravenous enough to sustain a sequel just 6 months later.
And if it's not?
If the first film underperforms, or if the cultural zeitgeist simply rejects the premise, you are now holding a 9-figure asset that is effectively dead on arrival.
Ouch!
And you still have to spend $50 million just to market it. It is an attempt to artificially manufacture event-level serialization in theaters, completely bypassing the natural organic demand cycle.
So if studios are terrified of generating new IP because of the marketing costs, and they are simultaneously stretching current narratives past their natural breaking point, how do they keep the machine running when a story legitimately cannot go forward?
Well, they look backward. They begin the process of chronological excavation.
The art of the squeeze.
Exactly.
This is where I really have to push back on the studio's strategic vision here. Looking through the 2026 television and film slate, it honestly seems like development executives are just laying out a fictional timeline on a desk, taking a magnifying glass, finding an unexplained 10-year gap between major events, and saying, hey, let's build a 3-season television show right there.
Right.
Are we just substituting actual storytelling with bureaucratic prequelism?
It's a valid question.
Yeah.
It is a symptom of treating intellectual property as a finite geography that must be fully colonized. And a perfect example of this is hitting on January 19th.
A Night of the Seven Kingdoms.
Yes.
The new Game of Thrones spin-off. And the specifics in the research on this are just incredible. This show is not a direct prequel to the main series, nor is it a direct sequel to House of the Dragon.
No, it's sitting right in the middle.
Yeah, it is set exactly 90 years before Game of Thrones and roughly 100 years after House of the Dragon. They have mathematically calculated the exact dead center of the existing timeline and just dropped a show right into it.
They did.
The notes explicitly highlight that the network is leaving absolutely no era of Westerosi history untouched.
If we look at the mechanics of world-building sustainability, the corporate logic is actually quite sound.
How so?
HBO is leveraging the immense emotional and temporal investment the viewer has already made. You, as the audience, already understand the geopolitical rules of Westeros.
Right, I know how King's Landing works.
Exactly. You know the hierarchy of the noble houses, you understand the geography. The network does not have to spend 3 episodes explaining the rules of magic or politics to you. They completely bypass the friction of exposition.
Yes, I get that. But I would argue that bypassing that friction destroys the very mechanism that makes fantasy compelling in the first place, which is the mystery.
The sense of the unknown.
Exactly. Part of the allure of Game of Thrones in the early seasons was the weight of ancient history. The characters whispered about the Mad King or the doom of Valyria as these terrifying mythical events.
Right.
When you systematically go back and illuminate every single shadow in a fictional universe, when you document every single Tuesday in the Targaryen dynasty, you strip away the myth and you replace it with a Wikipedia article.
That's a fair criticism.
A universe only feels vast when there are things we do not know.
The transition from myth to mundane bureaucracy is definitely the primary risk of prequelism. When a universe becomes a closed loop, the narrative tension naturally evaporates because the endpoint is already fixed in the audience's mind.
And we are seeing this exact phenomenon play out on November 20th with The Hunger Games, Sunrise on the Reaping.
Another prequel.
Yes, we're going back to explore the specific origins of the reaping process itself. The research notes that the author, Suzanne Collins, is continually dropping new lore, just returning to the well every few years.
Right.
But we already know the macro narrative. We know Katniss Everdeen eventually topples the Capitol. So now the only direction to go is to see how the terrible legislation was drafted in the first place.
It speaks to a modern audience's compulsion to demand explanations for the origin of literally everything. We are no longer satisfied with accepting that a dystopia just exists as a premise for a story.
We need the receipts.
Exactly. We demand to see the zoning permits for the arena. We want to see the boardroom meetings where the evil was standardized. It is storytelling focused on infrastructure rather than character evolution.
Wow, zoning permits for the arena. That is spot on. But, there is one chronological experiment in 2026 that actually seems creatively justified, and that lands on November 26th with the Chronicles of Narnia, The Magician's Nephew.
Yes, helmed by Greta Gerwig. Stepping into this massive project following the absolute cultural and financial dominance of Barbie.
And her approach here is genuinely fascinating. The notes point out that she is not starting this adaptation with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe.
Which is the most famous book.
Right, the one everyone knows, and the one the previous film franchise started with. Instead, she is treating the IP chronologically. The Magician's Nephew was published later, but functionally, within the timeline of the universe, it is the origin story.
It sets the stage.
Yeah, it explains the creation of Narnia, the origin of the White Witch, and the planting of the Wardrobe Tree. The research actually compares this to a Star Wars-style chronological rollout.
Which is a massive subversion of studio instincts.
How do you mean?
Typically, you lead with your most recognizable asset to secure the highest possible opening weekend box office. You want Aslan front and center.
Right.
Gerwig, however, appears to be treating the bibliography as a historical text to be adapted in its proper narrative sequence, completely regardless of pop culture brand recognition.
It is a massive flex of her current cultural capital. I mean, she is essentially saying, I am going to build the foundation of this world before I give you the iconic characters you were expecting.
It's a bold move.
Very. But if we want to talk about intricate, interconnected timelines and the consequences of mapping out fictional universes, we really have to look at the superhero space. Because 2026 is the year the two major comic book publishers go to war with completely opposing philosophies.
The comic book multiverse pivot. Both Marvel and DC are staring down the barrel of superhero fatigue right now, and they have constructed radically different lifeboats.
Let's break down these architectures. I will argue that Marvel's approach, while incredibly dense, is functionally superior because of its compounding investment strategy.
Okay, lay it out.
Marvel is operating like a mutual fund. They were meticulously laying down track, connecting minor properties to major events, and building toward this inescapable climax. DC, on the other hand, is operating like a venture capital firm.
A venture capital firm, I like that.
Yeah, they're throwing money at distinct, standalone auteur swings, just hoping one of them becomes a unicorn. Let's look at Marvel's 2026 roadmap first, because every single release is mathematically engineered to point toward December 18th. Avengers, Doomsday.
The ultimate anchor point. The structural load-bearing beam of their entire decade, hinging entirely on the massive, unprecedented return of Robert Downey Jr. playing Dr. Doom.
It's huge, but look at the table setting required to get there. It starts way back on January 28th with Wonder Man.
Right.
Now, the research you brought is incredibly candid here. It notes that baseline expectations for this character are pretty low among the general public.
Wonder Man isn't exactly a household name.
Exactly. However, it is heavily rumored and structurally necessary that the events of Wonder Man will establish the connective tissue leading into Doomsday and the subsequent Secret Wars.
And this is the double-edged sword of the mutual fund approach you mentioned. Marvel has successfully trained its audience that no entry is truly minor.
You can't skip anything.
Right, you cannot skip the ostensibly smaller shows because they contain the specific narrative codes required to unlock the major theatrical events.
Exactly, they enforce participation. Moving to March, we have Daredevil, Born Again. The notes confirm the showdown between Kingpin and Matt Murdock, and importantly, the appearance of the black stealth suit.
Fans love that.
But the real strategic move here is the confirmation that legacy street-level characters from the old Netflix era, specifically Jessica Jones and Luke Cage, are now fully integrated into the mainline universe.
Consolidating assets. Though the notes are careful to point out the status of Iron Fist remains unknown.
Which I don't think anyone is losing sleep over, let's be honest.
Fair enough.
But it shows Marvel vacuuming up all its disparate IP to fortify the main timeline. Then we have Vision Quest, and the narrative heavy lifting this show has to perform is just absurd.
It really is.
The research outlines that it must resolve the emotional fallout of WandaVision, integrate the magical elements from the Agatha series, address the larger AI themes within the universe, and it features the return of James Spader in live action as Ultron.
We really need to talk about narrative debt here.
A narrative debt.
Yes. In serialized storytelling, every time you introduce a mystery, a new character, or a cliffhanger, you take on narrative debt. You promise the audience a payoff.
Okay, I follow.
Marvel has accumulated massive narrative debt across its Disney Plus era. Shows like Vision Quest are essentially the balloon payments. They are highly functional pieces of content designed to clear the ledger before a major theatrical convergence.
It's basically a traffic jam of plot resolution. Throw in a Punisher special and X-Men 97 Season 2, which the notes mention must deal with Apocalypse after a time travel-heavy first season, and the calendar is completely packed.
It's exhausting just listing them.
It is. But the final crucial piece of scaffolding before Doomsday hits is on July 31st with Spider-Man. Brand new day.
Tom Holland's return.
Right. And the notes specifically highlight that this is the launch pad for a grounded new trilogy. The director's receiving high praise internally for promising to deliver visceral action, but structurally it serves as the direct preamble to Doomsday. Marvel is heavily relying on this intricate, unbroken continuity.
But observe the fragility of that architecture.
Fragility? It seems robust.
Well, if the audience experiences friction, like if they don't have a Disney Plus subscription to watch Vision Quest, or if they miss the Punisher special, their comprehension of Doomsday is compromised. The barrier to entry for a new viewer in 2026 is astronomical. It practically requires a syllabus.
Wait, so they're basically making us do homework.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which brings us nicely to DC's venture capital playbook. If Marvel is demanding you study the syllabus, DC is just handing out standalone graphic novels and setting the library on fire.
That's a very vivid image.
They are pivoting hard into distinct genre exploration.
It is a strategy of aggressive differentiation.
Let's look at June 26th. Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, starring Millie Alcock. The notes confirm Jason Momoa is involved, playing the bounty hunter Lobo.
Which is great casting.
It is. But the most critical detail in the research is the tone. It explicitly emphasizes that this adaptation is leaning heavily into the gritty, brutal, and intensely violent nature of the comic book source material.
Right.
This is a complete rejection of the standard, uplifting, four-quadrant superhero origin template.
By leaning into violence and brutality, DC is clearly signaling that their universe is not a monolith. They are allowing the specific character to dictate the cinematic genre rather than forcing the character to conform to a corporate house style.
And the ultimate proof of that strategy lands on September 11th with Clayface. We're getting a movie focused on a Batman villain, but the notes point out it is establishing a dark, terrifying Gotham atmosphere long before the new cinematic Batman is even cast.
Which is fascinating.
And the mastermind behind this, Mike Flanagan.
A fascinating convergence of IP and auteur. I mean, Flanagan is arguably the preeminent architect of modern emotional horror, known for The Haunting of Hill House and Midnight Mass.
He is bringing a pure, unadulterated gothic horror sensibility to a comic book property. Add in The Lantern Show, which is introducing Hal Jordan and Jon Stewart in what looks like a grounded terrestrial detective format, and you have 3 projects with wildly different tonal signatures.
Very different.
So I will put it to you. If Marvel's interconnected machine requires too much homework, does DC's disconnected genre hopping risk alienating an audience looking for a cohesive universe? Which is the healthier long-term model.
DC's model is inherently more resilient. Think about it. In Marvel's mutual fund approach, if one sector crashes, if an interconnected movie completely bombs its threads, it threatens the structural integrity of the entire phase.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly. But in DC's venture capital model, failure is localized. If a brutal Supergirl film doesn't connect with audiences, it has absolutely no bearing on Mike Flanagan's gothic Clayface movie. The tones are insulated from one another.
And that makes sense.
Plus, treating the IP like a sandbox for distinct directorial voices prevents aesthetic fatigue. I suspect DC's approach is the only way to ensure the superhero genre survives the decade.
Insulating the IP through genre. I love that concept. And if DC's strategy is relying on an auteur like Mike Flanagan to turn a comic book movie into a horror film, it forces us to really examine why that specific genre is carrying so much weight in Hollywood right now.
The horror slate is huge.
Because looking at this calendar, the horror renaissance is by far the most creatively unhinged section of the year.
It is the only space in modern theatrical distribution where true, radical creative risk is not just permitted, but actively encouraged by studio executives.
I am consistently blown away by the madness that horror directors are allowed to put on screen. Case in point, December 25th. counter-programming Christmas Day with Robert Eggers' Werewolf.
Yeah.
Now, Eggers is a filmmaker who operates on an entirely different frequency.
He really is. He's an archaic auteur. With films like The Witch and the Lighthouse, his primary concern is anthropological accuracy, often at the expense of traditional narrative comfort.
And he is doubling down here. The research reveals this is a period-accurate werewolf film. The detail that is absolutely wild is the linguistics.
The dialogue.
The notes explicitly state that the English spoken in this film is so historically dense, so deeply archaic, that modern audiences will likely require subtitles just to comprehend the dialogue.
On Christmas Day.
Wait, they are releasing a wide distribution movie in Old English on Christmas Day that makes linguistic demands of its audience.
Nice.
And beneath that layer of complexity, the narrative relies on the most stripped-down, primal premise possible. One man, another man, and a werewolf.
We really must analyze the unit economics of horror to understand why a studio allows this.
Explain.
If Robert Eggers wants to make a science fiction epic with archaic dialogue, the budget would be, say, $200 million. And the studio would immediately fire him because the financial risk is untenable.
Right.
But a horror movie about 3 entities in a contained location, the budget is likely $20 million. The financial barrier to entry is so low that the studio's risk profile drops to near zero. If it fails, it is a simple write-off. If it hits, it generates massive profit. The economics of horror subsidize extreme artistic freedom.
The sandbox is cheap, so the directors can build whatever they want.
Exactly.
And we see that freedom used to aggressively reclaim existing IP, like with The Mummy hitting on April 17th.
This is a very significant tonal pivot.
When most people hear The Mummy, they are conditioned to think of Brendan Fraser, Rachel Weisz, swashbuckling adventure, and pulp action. But the notes detail that this new iteration is being produced by James Wan's Blumhouse and directed by Lee Cronin.
Right, and Cronin directed Evil Dead Rise, which was an absolute masterclass in claustrophobic, relentless tension.
And the research specifies that they are completely abandoning the action-adventure vibe. They are also distancing it from the cinematic style of the Conjuring universe. They were stripping The Mummy down to pure, terrifying scares.
Going back to its roots.
They were taking a blockbuster monster and turning it back into an actual monster.
It is an IP correction. They are identifying that the core utility of a monster is to induce fear, not to facilitate an Indiana Jones-style treasure hunt.
But horror also knows how to deliver exactly what the core base demands. We have Scream 7 on February 27th, which the notes indicate is continuing its very specific high-wire act of balancing extreme brutality with the unintentional, situational meta-humor the franchise is known for.
A classic formula.
On July 24th, we have Evil Dead Burn, the direct follow-up to Evil Dead Rise. The only mandate here, according to the research, is an absolute escalation of visceral brutality, gore, and violence.
It is the delivery of pure sensory stimulation. The narrative is almost secondary to the physical reaction of the audience.
And rounding it out, we have the sheer persistence of the franchise reliables. August 21st brings Insidious, The Bleeding World. The notes hilariously observe that this franchise has generated so many installments, prequels, and parallel timelines that even the most dedicated fans have lost the thread of the macro narrative.
It's got very convoluted.
We also have Smile 3 pending, trying to regain footing after what the notes describe as a quote-unquote mid-second entry following a brilliant first film. It is a massive spectrum, from Eggers' anthropological nightmare to the popcorn gore of Evil Dead.
And it thrives precisely because it operates outside the crushing financial pressure of the 4-quadrant blockbuster model.
But what happens when that crushing financial pressure is the entire point? Let's move away from the cheap sandboxes and talk about the theatrical monuments of 2026. The blank checks.
The big ones.
Because when I map out the end of this calendar year, I have a genuine logistical question. Can the global theatrical infrastructure, like the physical movie theaters themselves, survive the month of December 2026?
It is going to be an unprecedented stress test for exhibition bandwidth and premium large format screen allocation.
Well, let's build the momentum toward December because the scale of these releases is staggering. July 17th, The Odyssey, Christopher Nolan. We touched on this earlier, but I want to dive into the technical details the research provides.
Okay.
This is shot entirely on 70mm IMAX film, and the notes anticipate it will completely dominate the premium large format theaters for weeks with zero competition.
We have to understand what it means to mandate an IMAX release.
What does it mean?
Nolan is not just shooting a movie. He is engineering a mandatory physical event. In an era where audiences are conditioned to wait 45 days for a movie to hit a streaming platform, Nolan shoots on a film stock so massive and with an aspect ratio so specific that it physically cannot be replicated on a television screen.
Oh, that's brilliant.
He is leveraging format to combat streaming. By monopolizing the IMAX screens, he dictates the terms of engagement. You either see it in his preferred format, or you're experiencing a severely compromised version of the text.
It is the ultimate flex of directorial leverage. Then we have a massive test of platform migration on May 22nd with Star Wars, The Mandalorian and Grogu.
This is a critical inflection point for the Walt Disney Company.
Absolutely. They are taking the flagship character of the Disney Plus streaming era and demanding that audiences now pay a theatrical ticket price to continue the narrative. Pedro Pascal returns, and the research points out the film has to navigate the complex, somewhat convoluted fallout of Season 3 and the Book of Boba Fett. It is a huge gamble. Will the built-in streaming audience actually migrate back to the multiplex?
It remains to be seen.
We also have the monster economy to consider. February 27th brings Monarch, Legacy of Monsters Season 2. The notes highlight the shift in focus from Godzilla to Kong, maintaining a massive blockbuster budget on a television scale.
The scale is huge on that show.
But the true kaiju event lands on December 15th with Godzilla -0.
The sequel to what was arguably the most universally respected monster film of the decade.
Yes, the research labels Godzilla -1 a masterpiece, noting how it perfectly captured the terrifying apocalyptic nature of the creature. The anticipation for -0 is immense. But all of this, the IMAX domination, the Star Wars migration, the Godzilla hype, it's all just the preamble to the most aggressive scheduling standoff in modern Hollywood history.
Here it comes.
December 18th, 2026.
The Clash.
Two cultural behemoths opening on the exact same day. Dune 3 going head-to-head with Avengers. Doomsday.
It's unbelievable.
Denis Villeneuve's final installment of the Dune saga, which the notes promise will answer massive narrative questions, while also warning that it could be highly controversial if it faithfully adapts the darker, more cynical elements of the source material, Dune Messiah.
Which is very dark.
Releasing identical hours alongside the return of Robert Downey Jr. to the Marvel Universe. It is a billion-dollar game of chicken. I don't buy that the state holds. One of these studios has to blink and move their release, right?
Historically, yes. The conventional wisdom of theatrical distribution dictates that two massive tentpoles cannot open on the same weekend without cannibalizing each other's opening weekend gross. Someone always retreats to November or January.
Right.
But we are looking at a unique evolution in audience segmentation here.
How so?
Because the emotional propositions of these two films are diametrically opposed. Doomsday is the culmination of pop culture serialization. It is communal, nostalgic, and loud.
Right cheering in the theater.
Exactly. Dune 3 is sweeping, philosophical, and visually austere. They cater to very different psychological needs. I actually believe the global market has the bandwidth to support both simultaneously. The real issue is not audience cannibalization. It is the marketing oxygen.
Marketing oxygen. Explain that.
To open a film of this scale requires roughly $150 million in global marketing spend. When two films are spending that amount simultaneously, the cultural airwaves become completely saturated.
I see.
The cost of acquiring a single ticket buyer skyrockets because you are shouting over a deafening PR machine. The studios aren't afraid of the audience. They're afraid of the marketing inefficiencies of competing for billboard space and digital impressions.
It's a war of attrition on our attention spans. Now, as massive as Dune and Avengers are, the 2026 calendar proves that the traditional cinematic spectacle is no longer the only game in town.
Not anymore.
The research notes highlight a massive tectonic shift in where Hollywood is sourcing its IP. We have officially entered the era of the video game and anime adaptation boom.
It is the inevitable demographic shift. The generations whose primary narrative diet consisted of interactive media and Japanese animation are now the dominant economic force at the box office.
But Hollywood's methodology for handling this IP is completely chaotic. Look at the Resident Evil live-action reboot.
Now, this is a perfect example.
The notes are very explicit here. The studio has commissioned a complete reboot that intentionally abandons all the core characters from the video games.
Right.
Help me understand this. I mean, why would a massive corporation spend millions of dollars to acquire the rights to a globally recognized video game franchise, only to jettison the very elements that made it recognizable in the first place? It defies basic logic.
It reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what they're actually purchasing. They are not adapting a narrative. They are renting a title.
Renting a title, that is the perfect way to describe it.
A studio executive looks at the brand awareness of the words Resident Evil, and sees a marketing shortcut. But the filmmakers hired to execute the project often view the dense, convoluted decades of video game lore as an encumbrance.
They don't want to deal with it.
Right. So they write an original zombie script and simply slap the rented title onto it to guarantee an opening weekend baseline. It is an exercise in brand exploitation that fundamentally betrays the architecture of the source material.
And it alienates the core fans instantly. But then we see the exact opposite strategy yielding massive dividends. Look at April 3rd with Super Mario Galaxy.
A completely different approach.
The research points out how wildly fun and successful the first film was. And why was it successful? Because it was obsessively reverent to the source material. The sound design, the physics of the jumps, the color palette. It honored the architecture of the game.
Yes, the reverence paid off.
We see the same reverence with One Piece Season 2 hitting Netflix on March 10th. They honored the spirit of the anime, and the audience rewarded them.
Reverence is the new metric for success in this space.
We also have Mortal Kombat 2 on May 15th. The notes mention this was delayed to avoid clashing with Warner Bros.' internal slate, but it's positioned as a massive popcorn flick.
And the casting is interesting.
Very. Carl Urban stepping in as the arrogant movie star Johnny Cage. That signals a very specific self-aware tonal shift for a franchise built on hyperviolence. We also have a live-action Street Fighter that the research describes as leaning entirely into physical spectacle, casting half the WWE roster alongside action star Vidyut Jamwal.
That was huge globally.
But the adaptation that absolutely fascinates me drops on June 5th. Masters of the Universe.
Bringing He-Man back to live-action cinema.
And the creative choices outlined in the notes are brilliant. Yes, casting Mark Hamill to voice Skeletor is incredible, but the narrative focus is what works. The film is deeply exploring the absurd dynamic between the cowardly, unassuming Prince Adam and his massive, heroic, alter ego He-Man, who is summoned by lightning and a sword.
Right, the core premise.
It also focuses on his cowardly pet tiger, who transforms into an armored beast. They aren't trying to make a gritty, dark reimagining of a 1980s toy commercial. They are actively embracing the inherent absurdity of the premise.
Which is really the only viable path for that specific intellectual property.
I agree.
The moment you apologize for the silliness of He-Man by trying to make it a serious geopolitical fantasy, you completely lose the essence of the brand.
Speaking of embracing the physical reality of an IP, we have to touch on the Moana live-action film on July 10th. Dwayne Johnson returns as Maui.
Okay.
But the specific detail the research highlights is that Johnson is not relying on his own incredibly famous physique. He is utilizing a prosthetic muscle bodysuit to replicate the impossible, exaggerated, animated build of the character.
It is a remarkable concession of ego to the visual language of the original text.
It really is.
He is prioritizing the silhouette of the animated character over the branding of his own body.
So when we look at this entire landscape, the reverence of Mario, the cynical title renting of Resident Evil, the absolute commitment of Moana, why does Hollywood still struggle to find a baseline consistency when adapting these properties?
Because the executive class is still undergoing a psychological transition.
What do you mean by that?
Well, for decades, Hollywood viewed interactive media and animation as culturally inferior formats that required quote-unquote elevation through live-action adaptation. They genuinely believed they needed to fix the stories to make them palatable to a general audience.
Oh, wow.
But the recent financial dominance of these faithful adaptations has proven that the core audience is the general audience. The consistency will only arrive when the industry fully accepts that the original mediums were never broken to begin with.
The ultimate validation of the medium. Now, we have spent almost an hour dissecting IMAX swings, billion-dollar IP clashes, and horror bloodbaths. But there is an entirely separate ecosystem operating parallel to the multiplex that is quietly redefining narrative structure.
The television and streaming ecosystem.
Exactly. While the theatrical space is battling for survival, the streaming slate in these notes you brought is packed with high-concept experiments and intense character studies. So, what does this all mean for our Tuesday nights on the couch? Let's look at what this means for the medium starting on January 8th with a show that honestly sounds structurally exhausting. The Pit Season 2.
This is a prime example of format innovation.
The research details this as a medical drama shot in a highly stressful one-shot style. It is designed to capture the absolute unfiltered chaos of a hospital casualty ward and the crushing psychological weight on the doctors during an emergency shift.
We need to unpack the technical reality of one-shot filmmaking to understand why this is so impactful.
Please do.
In standard television production, you rely on coverage, meaning shooting a scene from multiple safe angles so you can manipulate the pacing and fix errors in the editing room. A one-shot completely removes the safety net of the edit. It requires staggering choreography between the camera operator, the actors, and the lighting department. If someone misses a cue at minute 45, you have to reset the entire hour.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. Psychologically, it traps the viewer in real time with the characters. There was no visual release valve.
It is pure, sustained anxiety. And we are seeing massive swings in science fiction as well. March 20th brings Project Hail Mary to streaming, starring Ryan Gosling, directed by Phil Lord and Chris Miller, the visionary minds behind the Spider-Verse films.
An incredible team.
The notes indicate the promotional material is incredibly strong, but there is immense curiosity about how Lord and Miller's kinetic, rule-breaking style translates to a grounded, hard sci-fi survival story.
They're directors who fundamentally reject conventional narrative structures, which makes them ideal for adapting complex, high-concept literature for a streaming audience that actually has the patience for intricate pacing.
The slate continues with relentless momentum. We have Invincible Season 4 arriving in March, proving that adult animated serialization is a massively viable demographic. We have Blade Runner 2099 on Amazon Prime.
Which is a fascinating economic anomaly.
Exactly. How does Amazon justify financing a high-budget series sequel to Blade Runner 2049, a film that is visually heralded as a masterpiece but famously underperformed at the global theatrical box office?
Because the unit economics of streaming are vastly different from theatrical distribution.
Walk me through it.
Amazon does not need a massive opening weekend gross. They need prestige titles that reduce subscriber churn and drive Prime membership retention. A cyberpunk epic with a dedicated cult following is highly valuable in this subscription model, even if it lacks four-quadrant theatrical appeal.
It is the ultimate long-tail investment. We also see streaming expanding existing universes in incredibly specific ways. The Boys. Vought Rising is detailed in the notes as a prequel murder mystery focusing on Homelander's father, Soldier Boy.
That should be wild.
We're getting Cruella too, expanding on a villain origin story that surprised everyone with its quality. And finishing out the highlights, we have Blue Eye Samurai Season 2.
Returning after a spectacular first season that really pushed the boundaries of adult animation and action choreography.
Looking at this streaming slate against the theatrical slate we just discussed, it feels like we're looking at two completely different industries.
If you analyze the macro trends, it becomes evident that streaming platforms have evolved into the research and development laboratories of Hollywood.
Oh, indeed.
The theatrical model, constrained by massive marketing budgets and the necessity of global appeal, relies on the safety of standard coverage, heavy CGI, and proven IP. But streaming platforms, insulated by subscription revenue, have the latitude to push technical boundaries like the real-time choreography of the pit and narrative boundaries. Streaming is where the actual language of visual storytelling is mutating and evolving, while the movie theaters are where the proven formulas are monumentalized.
The laboratory versus the monument. That is a brilliant distillation of the landscape. And as we pull back from this massive deep dive, looking across the entirety of the 2026 calendar you brought us, the sheer volume and complexity of the content are staggering.
It is undeniably a crucible year for the entertainment industry.
We are watching a business fight, a multi-front war for our attention. We have examined the vitamin M machine, forcing properties like Toy Story and Jumanji to endlessly cycle through artificial endings. We have explored the intricate, compounding narrative debt of Marvel's mutual fund approach against the explosive, auteur-driven venture capital of DC's Supergirl and Clayface.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We have seen how the cheap sandboxes of the horror renaissance allow Robert Eggers to demand we read archaic subtitles while watching a werewolf. And we are hurtling toward that unprecedented, terrifying clash in December, where the IMAX purism of Christopher Nolan and the uncompromising vision of Dune 3 collide with the pop culture gravity of Doomsday. It is a year testing the extreme limits of both corporate risk aversion and radical creative ambition.
It is the ultimate collision of art and commerce. And as we conclude this analysis, I want to leave you, the listener, with a structural question to consider.
Go for it.
We are staring down a 12-month slate where Christopher Nolan is testing the physical limits of 70mm exhibition, where Robert Eggers is utilizing dead languages for mainstream horror, and where Denis Villeneuve is steering a massive sci-fi franchise into highly controversial, cynical territory. Are we finally witnessing a breaking point? Are these filmmakers successfully rebelling against the safe, algorithmic, cookie-cutter blockbusters that have dominated the last decade? When you navigate this landscape and you finally sit down in a theater in December 2026, amid the marketing noise and the spectacle, which side of cinematic history are you going to buy a ticket for?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question right there. The calendar might just be a grid of days, but the battles fought on it this year will definitely define the medium for generation. Thank you so much for bringing in this incredible, exhaustive stack of research today. It has been a phenomenal breakdown of the mechanics behind the magic.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, keep exploring the narratives, question the strategies, and we'll see you in the deep.